Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome Heather Frommack with me today. Heather and I have known each other now for 6 or 7 years, and every time we get the opportunity to interact together, it's a joyous experience. And I've asked Heather to join me today to talk about the subjects of empathy and emotional intelligence, because we feel like this is something that is really necessary to teach our children and to model for our children and to emulate for our children. So we're really excited that you're joining us today. By way of introduction, I'm Gretchen Rowe. I'm the homeschooling mother of 6 for 43 more days, and then we'll graduate the last one. And I'm so delighted that Heather is joining me today. I want you to know that I'm monitoring the Q&A. So as you have questions, we're here having this conversation for your benefit. So we want to make sure that we answer the questions that you all may have. Don't hesitate to ask them. Heather, let you introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, I also just want to reiterate what Gretchen has said. We want this to be a conversation, not just between the two of us, but with all of us here. So please feel free to put it in the Q&A, and we'd love to incorporate your thoughts and experiences and questions into the conversation. So yes, I love Gretchen, and we have known each other closely, and I've admired her from afar as well for a long time in the homeschool community. I am a veteran homeschool mom of 5 kids. I have 3 biologically, 2 adopted. The 3 bio kids are grown and gone, and the 2 adopted are still at home. But as of last year, we shifted from homeschooling to private schooling. I am now a working full-time working mom, and it's a whole new life. And yet, as a theme in my life, I have really had a heart for helping to build bridges across cultures, helping to build bridges in relationships. And I think especially that passion, that desire grew a lot after we became adoptive parents. We're interracial family through that adoption. We moved from what our social worker said was an inconspicuous family to a conspicuous family as soon as we became an interracial family. And I think that experience has taught us a lot and continues to teach us a lot about empathy, the importance of it, and having it for ourselves and each other. So I'm really delighted to be here. I should also say that my previous role, I was director of outreach and educational consulting at the wonderful HSLDA. And in that space, we collaboratively built their first multicultural outreach program, which continues to grow and thrive and build bridges across cultures. So lots of wonderful resources there and experiences to draw from.
Absolutely. And Heather, I'd love for you to give our families a little bit of insight into your background, because I think your background is fascinating. And I think you're bringing a skill set to the table that makes you uniquely qualified to have this conversation with me today.
Well, that's very kind of you. And I have a special interest, both from a scholarly perspective as well as just a personal perspective, on empathy. But as you and I talked yesterday, very authentically, I'm certainly not here to say, hey, I've got this empathy thing figured out. I've taught my kids perfectly, and so look at me. That's not it at all. It's probably because of a desperate need for wanting empathy for myself, for my children, that it has become such an interest of mine. So my master's degree is in educational psychology, and in my thesis, I did a deep dive into how the brain operates related to empathy. And the reason for that was because I contextualized the research in this desire to see people build bridges relationally, especially across cultures. So empathy is fascinating because it is a part of how we were designed. It's not just something that Gretchen is good at. It is something that we are all designed to have and experience as a part of a holistic human experience. So I think it's a fascinating topic.
And toward that end, in our conversation yesterday, which was only an hour, but it could have been all day
So
long,
true.
I was learning so much from you. And I appreciate your genuineness in the things that you've had to say, but I wanted you to hit on that little piece that we talked about the neurobiology of empathy a little bit, because I
Yeah.
think it really makes a difference for us as parents to understand why this is important. So
Absolutely. I think this is so fascinating. And you and I were just geeking out on all the neurobiology and how interesting all of that is from a brain perspective, because we were literally wired to be empathetic. We have what are called mirror neurons in our brains. And you and I, everyone has experienced that. So, for example, if you were watching a spider crawl on someone else's arm, what is your reaction?
uh kind of, if it was a honeybee, I'd be fine, but if it was a spider, I'd be a little weirded out. So
Yes. And for many of us, if we don't like spiders, which most of us are not crazy about the idea of spiders crawling on us, we would literally physically feel a sense of our skin crawling. Maybe we might get chill bumps. We might have a physical reaction, and it's not happening to us. It is the same thing for when we watch a movie and we cry, or we are scared, and none of that is actually happening to us, but our mirror neurons are literally receiving that information and enabling a sense of empathy, because empathy is to feel what other people feel. And we are wired in that way. And there's different types of empathy. There's cognitive empathy, where you can choose to put yourself in someone else's position. And that has a term called perspective taking. It's where you literally think about, what would it be like? How would I feel if I were in that circumstance? So it's a very cognitive, intentional choice. Whereas then there's emotional empathy, which is what I just described, that spider crawling on. It's not necessarily something that you sat down and said, I want to feel this. It is a part of those mirror neurons capturing that emotion for you. So you and I were talking about how if we are literally designed, wired for empathy, then if we are not experiencing a very powerful part of our lives as empathetic people, we're sort of missing a part of the human experience. And that's not something any of us want for our kids.
absolutely. And I think being able to identify for our children the opportunity to read other people's emotions. I mentioned to you yesterday that one of my children was not adept at that. And so we used to play a game called Read the Room, where we had to stop and ask her to help identify other people's emotions in a situation. And it took her a long time. That she's an adult, and I asked her about this last night because of our conversation. I said, do you remember us doing it? She said, yeah, and the first 3 or 4 times you asked me to do it, I was just annoyed because I was telling a story and it felt like you weren't paying attention. And she said, and then I finally figured out that you wanted me to understand how my storytelling was affecting the people around me. I'm like, yeah, exactly. And she said, it really took me a long time, Mom. She said, now I look back on that and I'm kind of grateful that you made me do that, but I really hated it when we were doing it.
Honesty. And that's a really important part of empathy, right? Is that ability to be authentic with each other. And what a great practical approach you just explained for helping our kids with that cognitive type of empathy. Because the more intentional we are with cognitive approaches, over time, we can actually train ourselves to have that be a more automatic kind of experience. And I think this is a good time to talk about the difference between sympathy and empathy.
You're reading my mind. I love it.
Well, I don't want to get ahead of anything.
No, this is great. I think it's perfect.
Yeah, because I think it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to tell the difference. And I think it is much easier to teach sympathy than it is to teach empathy. Because when you think of sympathy as being that perspective of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So you're literally imagining what it would be like to be that person. Sympathy is more looking at those shoes and deciding, oh, I'm sorry that you have those shoes. And I'm sorry that those shoes are taking you to this place or that place. And so I might be still moved to compassion, but it's more from I'm looking top down rather inside that experience. And you and I were talking yesterday about a great resource I know you're going to share from Brene Brown, who's done a lot of research into this topic. And I like the way she mentions the distinction between sympathy and empathy. Empathy is when you know someone who's fallen into a pit and you climb into that pit and you're sitting with that person and hugging that person and listening. Sympathy is when you're looking down into the pit and saying, well, I'm sorry, but at least it's not this bad, or at least it's not that bad. And you're trying to, in some way, move people out of the emotion that they're having rather than entering into the emotion that they're having. So I think sympathy and empathy would be a great distinction to make early on, so we can talk about both of those as we proceed.
Right. And, when we live in a family, we have the opportunity to have those dynamics displayed on a daily basis. One of the things, I'm an only child. So
Okay.
it was a weird experience to have a bunch of kids. And my husband, who's one of 5, I would often turn to him and say, is this normal? In any given, and most of the time he would shrug and say yes. But the interesting thing that I think we kind of accidentally did is we told our children that their siblings were a gift to them, and that they needed to learn to rely on each other and support each other. And so competition between siblings was not allowed. Now, there's plenty of competition in our family because we have 6 firstborn kids and they're all like viciously independent.
Interesting
But
comment.
we wanted them to be supportive of one another. And now they're all, my youngest is almost 18. He's on the cusp of adulthood. And the 6 of them have a daily group chat where they check in with each other and send pictures to each other and see how they're doing. And I think that was something that we did a little bit by accident, but it was really an important thing to do. And if that's not something that's happening in your household, I want to encourage you to start to foster that. We're about to step into summer. It's a good time to start making some of these lessons intentional. And I think it would really be a terrific opportunity for us to help our kids learn to embrace that attitude of helpfulness. I don't know about you, Heather, but my kids always laugh because, if someone's carrying too many groceries through a parking lot, I'm going to stop what I'm doing and I'm going to help them carry the groceries through the parking lot. And I think if we model those kinds of things for our kids, it becomes an easier opportunity for us to then have a conversation. What did you think about that? How did you feel about that? How do you think that person felt about that?
That's awesome. And you're absolutely right that modeling is one of the most powerful ways to develop empathy. As we talked about, we are wired for empathy, but as all of us who have experienced life with more than one human being, we know that there's a continuum of natural abilities here. And so those opportunities for modeling can help develop that first step of cognitive empathy. But you have many children. I have 5. We've been around children forever and ever. And you can see that some children are born what are called empaths. And there's even a disorder called, I believe it's empathy contagion, in that it is this struggle with feeling too much of what other people feel. And so much so that it becomes distracting and overwhelming and just consuming. So that's one side of the continuum. And the other side of those kids, and I have some, I'm not going to say how many, but I have experience with that, with they have no natural propensity for empathy at all. And so, like you, we tried to be intentional in those spaces. And so my two oldest will not tell the story all the time, so they won't be offended. But my oldest son is a very deep thinker, sensitive, thoughtful, empathetic person. Whereas my next child is our oldest daughter, very practical. Just emotions seem like a real big waste of time. So what are we talking about here? And so there was easy offense happening all the time, because with homeschooling, you're together so much of the time. We all know this. So we would have what was called these parlor talks. And usually it was that she had offended her brother and she didn't understand at all why he was offended. And we would stay in that, it was the room in our house we called the parlor, until there was a glimmer of understanding on her side. We wouldn't leave until he had communicated and she had expressed some measure of, okay, I get you. And that little incremental bit upon bit upon bit, to this day, just like your daughter saying that it was exhausting at the time. We hated the process. But now they both will say, thank you so much for that parlor time, because they are close friends now and they have the opportunity to have perspective of each other and learn how to communicate through those things. So I think the reason I say that is for another practical idea, but also to be unlike I was and be patient with that incremental growth. Because I wanted that big aha for her to go, oh, I get it now. And I
totally can relate to that. Same thing with my daughter.
And I want that in my own life too. I want people who can immediately understand how I'm feeling and to be able to enter into that. And I think that's important, not just for children, but for us as adults too, to be patient as people wherever they are on this empathy continuum begin to grow. So
can you talk a little bit about cultural intelligence? Because I think this kind of goes hand in hand with empathy, but it also gives us the opportunity to now, what we've been talking about is internally within the family. And now I'd like to turn our attentions away a little bit to the larger world, because we need to model that sensitivity toward the world in which we live as well. So.
Yeah. Oh gosh, cultural intelligence, one of my favorite topics. Yeah. Well, cultural intelligence is it is what it can sound like. It's just being more intelligent about culture, being aware, but it is also an actual paradigm. It's a capability of it's a skill set based on 4 capabilities. It's CQ is cultural intelligence. It's built upon the research around EQ, emotional intelligence, and IQ. These are quotients of intellect. And so they start with drive, CQ knowledge, CQ strategy, and then CQ action. And it's a cycle. So the drive is just that beginning curiosity that says, Gretchen, I don't know much about your world. I want to know more. Would you be willing to talk about more? Then I'm building my CQ knowledge because I'm learning more about your culture, your background, your values. And then that can move into strategy, where now that I understand those things, I can plan for adapting, for being sensitive, for applying that awareness in a way that helps you. And then last is CQ action. I just take all those things and I actually enter your life, I enter your space, and I do it in a way that's effective. So that's a nutshell of cultural intelligence, but it is definitely a cycle of empathy as well. Because what we can often do when we're trying to be empathetic in other cultures is end up being sympathetic in a way that has an us and them kind of approach. So if we're willing to get into some, maybe, hey, we're going to be authentic here. Lots of times, I know even from my own personal experience, that's the sympathy perspective has been more the perspective I took in the past when I would go on a missions trip. Oh, these are suffering people. I am here with the resources, and it's an us and them, they and me. I have the resources, they have the need, and I'm doing a good thing because I'm bringing that. But what people find much more impactful is that you come with empathy. We have a shared humanity. We have a share, and what are the cultural differences that we have that we can understand to help us minister and address each other more effectively.
That's an interesting thought and a perspective, and I think we would be well served to allow our children to step into that world, to be able to see the world from other children's perspectives. I know my parents, because I was an only child, we had a foreign exchange student who lived with us almost every year that I was growing up.
Good for them.
And my father was a German immigrant, very by the rules. You will do it this way because all is in Ordnung. Yeah. And, but he was fascinating in the fact that he really wanted to understand other cultures' perspectives. And
that's awesome.
It was really neat. I didn't realize until I had been an adult for many years and he was passed away, how much he modeled that for me without ever saying a word.
Wow.
He just did it.
That's powerful.
And I think that is really interesting, and something that maybe we would have less conflict in the world at large today if we were more willing to embrace that a little bit.
I think this would be, I totally agree. And what your dad demonstrated was a lot of CQ drive and bringing those people into your life and into his life. And that speaks of the most powerful empathy builder in the world, which is relationships. Before I had Black children, I could sympathize with the suffering of an African American in my community or in my country. I could empathize with orphans or sympathize with orphans because, yeah, we care. But once I had adopted children who were once orphans, who are now Black living in the United States, I now have, while I can never fully understand that experience, I can feel it at another level because of the relationship. So now because of that power of the relationship, I'm more moved to actual compassion and action on behalf of those causes. And so your dad, by bringing people from other countries into your world, now I would imagine when you hear about things happening in that culture or that country, it has more of a visceral impact on you than it might on me, because I don't know people there. I haven't had those relationships.
It does. It was an interesting perspective, and I never really appreciated it until he was gone, and I didn't have the opportunity to thank him for it. So, you said something yesterday that I think is really important for us to address for the parents who are joining us today, and we have a lot of parents who are joining us. You said that we shouldn't set ourselves up as being the knowledge, but to be able to say, you said, I'm not sure I know how to answer all the hard questions that come up. So to be able to say to our children, I might not have the answers here, but let's see if we can work through this together, I think is very powerful. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, about how to engage your kids in these conversations.
Yeah, I think when you and I were talking about that yesterday, we were talking about how, especially as homeschool parents, having been a homeschool parent and now not having that same all day, every day kind of experience with my children, I know as a homeschool parent, I felt not only the responsibility to protect and filter their experience with the world, but also the power to do it. And when I was homeschooling, I know it was always a very strong temptation for me to only allow those messages or exposure to people or cultures into our world that I felt equipped to explain, to be able to say, here's the Black, here's the white of this topic here. We can be caring about those people, but we don't agree with them, or we don't associate with them, even in the worst case scenario. I did that for sure. Whereas I think real empathy grows in us as we're willing to walk into those spaces that we know are an important part of our influences around our kids, but we don't have all the answers. That we kind of walk through and say, I don't get that either. And yet I know that that person is made in the image of God, and they are valuable, and they probably have perspectives that I could learn from. So let's appreciate that and let's learn together. That's been very challenging for me, because it takes a lot more work than that instinct of putting people in a box and then only dealing with those. So I think that's what you and I were talking about a bit yesterday, and just being authentic here. That's been just a lot harder with my last two kids than it was with my first three. The world's changed a lot.
It has. And I think the world has changed post-COVID as well. We all spent way too long hunkered down. And when we came out of being hunkered down, sort of, I almost look as though that the empathy capacity in a lot of people was just pushed to the side or turned off or incapacitated. And so I think we need to figure out how to rekindle that. And I think that rekindling starts at home.
Yeah, because at that same time was really when the cancel culture grew stronger and stronger. And that's just a really perfect example of the impulse I was just describing. Look, I don't get you. I don't agree with you. And instead of trying to figure you out and learn from you, I'm just going to cancel you, because that's a heck of a lot easier than even sympathy. I mean, we're just throwing that out too. Forget it. We're not going to, for sure, not empathy, but not even sympathy. And I think, our children, whether we like it or not, most of them will not find an answer of, well, we just don't talk about that, or we just don't associate with those people, or we just don't agree with those people, to be satisfactory as an end answer. So it's our work to build relationships with people who are different from us. And as a way of, one of my favorite people in the whole world is Bob Goff. And are you familiar with Bob Goff?
I should be. The name is familiar, but for some reason I'm pulling a 404 error right here as we're having this conversation.
Completely fine. There's so many people in the world to be aware of and not be aware of. Okay, so here's a blanket recommendation for everyone. Bob Goff wrote the book, Everybody Always and Love Does. And he is, I have all of his books on Audible because he narrates them himself. I highly recommend them for you, your kids, everybody. He is a fantastic storyteller. And his message is this: love does, and love everybody always. And he's always gently pushing towards reaching into those relationships that are hard, that you wouldn't want to know, or you wouldn't naturally be a part of, because that's what love does. That's what Jesus embodied that. And that's what love does. So that's what if we're going to live a whole human life, that's what we get to do too. And it is that type of intentionality that slowly builds bigger and bigger empathy in us. So Bob Goff, everybody, Goff.
As soon as you said the title of the book, I was like, all right, now I know who we're talking about. And
Yes.
I knew that I had, another one that has been a touch point for me has been Brene Brown.
Yeah. Mhm.
Her books have been just so insightful to me because I do have that perfectionist tendency in my heart and in my soul. And I think that comes from a little bit of the good German background. Yeah, we will control all the environment. Yeah.
I love the accent.
Oh, and my father, I'm sure, is looking down at me just going,
Gretchen.
yeah, but
Gretchen, do better.
his accent was beloved. And my high school friends, when I pull out his accent, they're like, you can still do that?
You did grow up with it, by the way.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is, I think one of the things that we have to do is be intentional. And that's really the bottom line of the whole conversation we're having today, is having those intentional experiences, those conversations, that putting ourselves out there. And maybe that's what I see as the fallout from COVID, is we forgot how to put ourselves out there.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we did get really good at during COVID was watching Netflix. And and in fact, that is a fantastic way to allow your mirror neurons to help you build empathy. Because even if you aren't able to or inclined to get out there and build those relationships, there are all kinds of movies that will allow you to experience life from the perspective of another person, another culture, another perspective. As I said, it is a chance to really engage in that process of perspective taking with your kids right there in a safe environment, and an opportunity to talk about it later. So yeah, COVID was a divider, but it was an opportunity for us, for many people. It became empathy overload. It became so much suffering on a global scale and so much fear that many of us just shut down. It was too much. And so I think your point about intentionality, it is an opportunity for us to engage with re-entering, if we were one of those people that had to pull back, to maybe step into some new spaces in a more insightful way. We have a global perspective like we never have. So that's also a good thing.
Right. So I wonder if we had discussed the 4 qualities of empathy. And I know that you had said that I will have a resource for parents that'll be part of the show notes, and it'll be contained in there. And I think it's a terrific resource. But can we review or view the perspective taking and the staying out of judgment? Can we talk about those 4 qualities a little bit? The perspective taking, I think, was insightful for me because it's easy to see the world from my perspective.
Yeah,
it's harder to see the world from yours.
Yeah, you bet.
So I wonder if you could maybe give an example, maybe from your personal experience or from your studies, of how we could help our kids engage in perspective taking. And you had talked about parlor talks, and in my family it was to take a snapshot and read the room. But how can we help our kids do that when it maybe just even in our own family? What's a way to generate that perspective taking opportunity, maybe when there is conflict, to be able to do that?
Well, we've talked about quite a few things we could sum up too, that intentionality, or like you demonstrated with people in the grocery store or walking through the parking lot. And I also want to invite the audience, if there's any ideas or thoughts, things that you've done, or even things that you've struggled with. Like, I will tell, I think one of the things that Brene Brown says that's very tied to perspective taking is staying out of judgment. And I think that is a really great thing for us to talk about, both from a success perspective and a failure perspective, because the best way to stay out of judgment is to remember all of our own failures. I mean, not to dwell on them and be, crushed by them, but to remember that we are all doing the best we can, and we're making mistakes along the way. So if the audience has anything they want to share, my gosh, we'd love to incorporate that. But I remember one time I was going through a very, very, very painful time. And I couldn't really deal with it because we had to go to the grocery store. And it was just like one of those times you had to put on a happy face and keep going, right? And I had parked at the grocery store and I came, had all my groceries, came out to bring my stuff in and load the car. And on my car was a note. And I hadn't parked really well. And the note said, "Horrible parking. Do better." And I lost it at that moment because that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think about that a lot because that person only saw the result of my behavior. That person had no idea all the things that were motivating that behavior underneath. And so I think one of the things we can do with our kids is say, okay, so you see that behavior that's bothering all of us. What are some possible reasons that could be happening? Yeah. What if you were driving that car so fast or cut in front of me in line, or what would be some reasons you might do something like that? So that's a way we can help with perspective taking and not just look at that person and observe, but look at that person and imagine yourself in that situation.
Right. It's funny that you should bring that up because we had this conversation yesterday afternoon, and then I'm in the car running an errand and impatient with the car in front of me. And my first impulse is to just be impatient. But given the fact that we'd had the conversation yesterday, my next impulse was to think, okay, maybe there's a reason they're driving slowly. Now, I live in a retirement area.
Okay.
Most people here drive slowly, and I laughingly say I didn't have time to stand in the patient's line and have it. But it was very interesting coming out of our conversation yesterday to reflect on that. And I was in the car by myself, but then I had the idea to think, oh, I probably need to have a conversation with my 17-year-old because I bet I've been impatient with drivers in his presence.
Oh, yeah.
And now I need, now here's an opportunity for me to go back and say, yeah, now I have a bit of a different perspective. So let's talk about that. So,
well,
he's more than willing. Some 17-year-olds might not be, but he would be willing to have that conversation.
Oh, I love that. Well, I think one of the things you're pointing out is how good it is for our own mental health if we choose empathy instead of anxiety and judgment. Because we all are facing stress every day. And the more we judge other people, it brings angst and anger and irritability and stress that empathy removes. Yes. So that's a benefit for ourselves.
So I would love to turn our attentions to some of the practical conversations, questions that parents ask. I think both of us found them to be pretty terrific yesterday. And I wanted to just visit some of these and see what your observations were. One of them I thought that was particularly insightful was to teach my child to think of others. Mm-hmm. And I think as parents, that's a laudatory goal that we all want to have. Mm-hmm. How do we model that?
I think I have a lot of work to do on this with one of my children in particular, because that child's view and approach to life, the way that child sees the world, is so foreign to me. And I think that is the child I would also point to that seems to have the most struggle with empathy. And I think for me, one of the things I'm really working on is learning how to empathize with that child. And by stopping my own automatic approach to parenting or to rendering judgment on this activity or that behavior, I'm trying to learn to stop and put myself in this child's shoes and listen. And even though the things that that child wants to say or tell me about are things I really don't want to face or hear, or I don't see the world that way, by sitting and listening and entering in, I think that is one of the most powerful things we could do to teach our children to have empathy. Because when I do that with this child, that child seems to be much more inclined to listen to me and to apply that to others. So that would be, because I'm working on this so hard right now in my own life, that would be one of my first thoughts about that.
And we had a couple of parents who said, how am I going to teach emotional intelligence and empathy to my child who has special needs, who already sees the world through a different lens? And I think this is a great place for us to have a bit more conversation. I know I had two different learners in my family, and I had one child who was twice exceptional, and that child was like you described your daughter. Emotions were superfluous, not necessary to the experience. So helping him learn that they weren't a negative, that they weren't a detractor from the environment, was a really interesting perspective to be. And I think if you have a child who has different needs or special needs, I object to the term special needs, because I think it, by default, culturally, we imply that there's something less.
Yeah, I agree with
I don't
that.
think that's right. I think it's something different. Maybe it's not something that we all easily understand, but our lives are enriched by taking the time to create that understanding. And I wonder, I know you worked with a wide variety of families in your previous capacity.
Yeah.
Do you have any stories there that we could relate to that would help our parents understand how we could make that happen for kids who learn differently?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind in listening to you is what you're illustrating is how powerful language is. And that part of helping our children develop a shared language that's empathetic for themselves is the place to start, especially when we're talking about children with differences in learning, differences in relating, differences in connecting. That by starting with self-empathy, and this is in the research too, is that if we don't have empathy for ourselves, we cannot express it for others. And I think that when you're talking about a community of families or children who have those differences, there can be so much struggle with self-acceptance that creating that language that you just described, that's inclusive in all the best ways, that celebrates the superpower of differences, if that can be the culture of your family, you build a foundation for them to be empathetic with others. And it's easy to bypass that. We can make the assumption that, okay, we're already good. Now we have to have empathy for everybody else. But I think especially when you're talking about children who are struggling with certain things, starting with and really establishing that empathy for self is an important place to start.
Gina's offered a really good question that I think we should talk about. She says, what about the child that empathizes and feels everything, and it can make them stuck? They will obsess over the person on the street that is homeless or the dog wandering around. I know this is a hard question, and I should mention my girls have a trauma background, so I'm just thinking out loud. But boy, two of my daughters are that child now as adults, and I certainly can relate. I'm that person as well. I stop and help I'll make myself late for something to stop and help somebody else. And I cry at Charmin commercials too. So I understand what Gina's saying here. And I think it's important for us to help our kids learn to identify the stuckness.
Yes. Yeah. Well, as we talked about at the beginning, there is that condition of empathy contagion. Um, and it is a condition, and it is also, and it may or may not be what our listener is describing, but that trauma background, and all of us have some measure of trauma, but some more than others, as we well know. And there is a wonderful resource called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the gentleman's writing. He's a Dutch researcher. I'm sorry, I forget his name, but essentially what the book is all about, and it's a heady, long, actually quite traumatic book, because he talks about some very, very difficult experiences, stories in there. The point is that the trauma stays stuck in our bodies, and then our bodies express that in different ways. And
Bessel van der Kolk is
thank you.
the author. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes. And so when we're having those obsessive thoughts, when we're having those obsessive reactions, oftentimes it's because we have something stuck in our bodies, or an experience or an emotion or a memory that has not been fully released in a way that our minds now can deal with in a healthy way. Now, I'm not suggesting that's always why people are empathetic. I think it's a beautiful thing to be very, very empathetic, but finding that balance. And she used the word obsessive, I guess, obsess.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's possible that there's that component of that trauma really informing that empathy in a way that needs to be dealt with on a deeper level and released before healthy empathy can be experienced.
And I think it's important for us to say here that trauma is different for every person.
Yeah.
What would be traumatic for me might just roll off your back, and
Yes.
vice versa. I was actually doing some research for a talk I'm giving in May yesterday, and it was in that research, it was talking about children who have been bullied and PTSD.
Mhm.
And the researcher said some children can have one unkind thing said to them, and that
Yeah.
puts them in a cycle of what it has become a traumatic experience. And other
Mhm.
children can be repeatedly put in a situation that would be perceived as traumatic, and they don't react the same way. So I think it's important for us to make sure that by defining trauma here, we're not necessarily saying something awful has happened, but it's something for that child
Right.
has caused them to be fearful or anxious or
Mhm.
overly concerned about the environment. And I think
Mhm.
that's an important thing. I will tell you another researcher, since we're talking about Bessel van der Kolk, his name is Dr. Gabor Mate,
Okay.
and he is a trauma researcher. He's an MD from Canada. And I became acquainted with his work in the last year. I've now read 3 of his books.
Wow.
His books are absolutely fascinating. Like you said, they're not light reading,
No.
but they have been absolutely fascinating for me to understand the world from other people's perspectives. And interestingly enough, one of those books is entitled In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And it's definitely not light reading,
Yeah.
but talking about having worked for 20 years as an addiction MD on
Wow.
the streets of Canada.
Mm.
And very insightful. So if you want, and he actually has another book that is entitled Scattered Minds, and this is where I started my research with him. His book is about attention deficit disorder and how it has roots in trauma. That was really, really interesting.
That is interesting.
And Gina says she has read that book and she agrees, and thanks us for commenting. She said both of her girls are adopted from foster care and they have such big hearts, but definitely empathize with others in different ways and have different anxieties. And I think that's really true. I think one of the mistakes I made with my children is expecting them to react the same way.
Yes, yes, right. Or the
And
way that we would. Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
exactly.
yes.
Yes.
And I have these glasses on, and it's funny because before you and I started recording, we were trying to get the lighting right, and you're like, Heather, is your camera clean? Because it looks really foggy. And lo and behold, hey, I cleaned it off, and hey, we could see me better after that. That was great. And I think that it's so helpful to remember that we're all looking at life and each other and experiences through our own lenses, through our cultural lenses, our values lenses, our experience lenses. And I think if there's any take-home message in all of this, whether it's Bob Goff or Brene Brown or the ideas presented today, empathy is all about that awareness of acceptance and not being judgmental, recognizing that we can all come to this from a space of curiosity in rather than judgment. So often we feel our lenses get clouded by fear, by projecting into the future, frankly, I'm just bewildered half of the time when I'm talking to some of my children about the things that they're experiencing or the questions that are going through their minds now that weren't going through my other children's minds because of the differences in culture. So just remembering that we have these lenses, but we're wired for empathy can be a real double-edged sword to help us be effective as we step into these spaces with our kids.
I just in the past, actually last night, I finished reading a book that it's a fictional accounting of bullying. Mm-hmm. And one of the parents asked a question, so how does this apply to teens? And I think it applies to teens maybe more than it applies to adults, because they're in the process of learning who they are, separate from who we are.
Yeah.
And I think if we can raise a generation that can speak up against the bullying that has become so omnipresent in culture now, we can change the outcomes for the next generation. So I think it does apply particularly to teens. And if it's conversations that you haven't had intentionally with your students, with your children, with your grandchildren, it's time to start having those intentional conversations. My husband is, he's a great guy, but he's an inveterate tease. And if he doesn't tease you, he doesn't like you.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
This is what my kids say, if he's not teasing you, he doesn't like you. But the flip side of that is he doesn't always see when his teasing is not being received. And sometimes I'll have to take him aside and say, no, you missed it. You were a little bit too over the top in that. And that's his personality. That's how he was raised. That's the culture that he comes from. Able to be comfortable with saying, nah, I think you got that one wrong, and learn from each other, I think is huge. And I think as parents, we have to be able to let our kids come to us and say, I think you got that one wrong.
Yes.
That hard.
That humility is so powerful as parents. I'm looking at the time and thinking, oh my word, it's almost an hour. That's amazing.
I know.
Love talking to you, Gretchen. So I would just say, if we were to kind of sum up the things that have stuck out to me in this conversation, is the fact that we're wired for empathy, and that empathy and sympathy are different. Sympathy is looking at and on and putting judgment on, even if it's good judgment, like I want to help you. Empathy is getting inside. And we also talked about ways that we can build on that cognitive empathy ways that we can enter into other people's lives relationally. We can enter into other people's lives through movies. And I'm happy to send you a list of some of the movies that we've found to be most powerful in our family, recognizing everybody has different filters for movies. So always check first. But there's also the opportunity to recognize the invisible biases we may be bringing in because of our cultural lenses and just what we're comfortable with. And finally, just the power of relationship and the fact that we have people who've stayed on this conversation for this amount of time is as a real indicator of their intentionality and the ability to start with self-empathy, building that in ourselves, building that in our children, knowing that we're all special, we all have superpowers, we're all doing the best we can, and trying and failing and succeeding all over this messy space. I think all of those things are helpful, with the most important thing being Bob Goff. Remember remember my hero, Bob Goff.
I will make sure that his name, as well as Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and Dr. Gabor Mate, are all included in the show notes, because I think
And
they
Brene
provide
Brown.
us resources outside of ourselves.
Yes, absolutely.
Before we began, I was talking about next week, we're going to have a conversation about recovering from perfectionism. And I think
Great.
you just said something that's really, really important. And it starts with our willingness to forgive ourselves when we miss the mark. And sometimes as parents, we don't want to have our children see us make mistakes. We think that they'll be uncomfortable if they don't see us having it all together. And I think really the opposite is true.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They already know we're messed up. They already do. I mean, we might as well just put it on the table and talk about it. I think it helps us all with that humility that's so foundational to us loving each other, to us just really wanting to step into those spaces that are uncomfortable and being honest about that. So that authentic humility can help with those conversations too. Because we're not fooling anybody. I thought for a long time I was, but no, I'm not.
Well, I also had the perception that they would be uncomfortable if I admitted my own failings, my failings.
Yeah.
By admitting my failings to them only gave them the comfort to be able to admit their own failings.
Yeah. Yeah. Good word.
That makes a tremendous amount of difference. I want to thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. I think this is something that we don't often think about, but maybe it's something we should think about more often. Because in our goal of parenting our children to adulthood, we, as my husband says, we want to raise contributing members of adult society who don't live with us. This is part of that contribution.
Yes.
I think it absolutely makes a difference. So I want to thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody who is here listening to us today. I want to thank you for trusting us, for the information we've shared with you. We come into your home on a weekly basis, and we're grateful for that opportunity. This is Gretchen Rowe for the Demme Learning Show, and I want to thank you again for being here. You can find the show notes and watch the recording at demmelearning.com show, or on your favorite podcast outlet. This will be airing as a podcast this Friday, and it will, of course, be posted on our blog. You can also find it on our YouTube channel. Be sure to rate and review and follow or subscribe wherever you may be hearing this, especially if you really enjoyed it. Thank you again for joining me today, Heather. I appreciate it more than you know.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody else. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.